Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson, and if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate the show. That helps people to discover it on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and it's also on Rumble. Enjoy the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.
All right, Ed, thank you for joining me.
All right, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been diving into some of the stuff you've been doing and listening to you on some podcasts, looking at some of your things online, and I find it to be super fascinating. So I'm honored to have you here and to dive into some of your research and some of your life's work and see what you're doing with this neural resonance theory. And
Cool.
Maybe go back in time and you could introduce yourself, talk a little bit about some of what you're doing currently and how you got here, and then we'll go into some of how you got here.
Sure. So I suppose I could go back as far as like college, and I started out as a math major, and then I switched over to major in music and did some classical guitar performance, and really wasn't sure, sort of where I was going to go from there. And I decided to go for a master's degree in computer science. It was the 80s. Computers were, personal computers were just getting started. I thought, maybe I'll start a little music software company or something. And when I got to graduate school, I realized there were these people that were studying music from a scientific point of view. And as soon as I saw that, boom, that was me. That's me. That's perfect for me.
Nice.
And I've been doing it ever since. I haven't looked back. This is, it's as though it's a field that was made for me, really.
That's amazing.
And so since then, I've been focusing on the basic neuroscience of music. When I started, we'll get into this. I was very interested in tonality and how notes fit together within a key and so forth, and improvisation. But I found that too hard to start with, and I went to rhythm.
Okay.
And I found this approach to rhythm, which was a neurodynamic approach, which we'll get into. And I did that for a while, and I came back, and I did go into tonality and so forth. And then most recently, I have been focused on a company that we founded a few years ago, where we're trying to use music to help people with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So it's been a long road, but there is this, this music and science thing that links it through, all through.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about it and to talk about some of the things that you've done to help patients that are suffering in different ways and how music can be healing, really. But I'd love to hear just some general perspectives that you have as a neuroscientist. I've had people like Carl Friston and Anil Seth and really big names in the neuroscience field talking about their theories of consciousness. Right. And how they approach thinking about the mind-body problem and things like that. I'd love to first get a little bit of a foundation of how you approach your theory of the mind or theory of consciousness, if you don't mind. Like, how do you think about the way you approach thinking about the brain?
Well, so I would say first, I have not yet been presumptuous enough to formulate a theory of consciousness. And I think it's a very interesting problem. Been reading about it since graduate school. A lot of interesting questions there. But really, my focus has been to approach the whole thing through music.
Yeah.
And I think when you think about music, it gives you a completely different perspective. So you use the term the mind-body problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is a mind-body problem. Or there isn't a problem as long as you don't think the mind is separate from the body. So and again, this comes from music. When you think about music, you think about performing music, or you think about going to a concert.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking now of Grateful Dead concerts because, Tom Weir recently passed away, or Bob Weir, sorry, recently passed away.
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole body experience. There is no, my mind is making a prediction and it's not satisfied by the music, therefore I should move my body. It's not,
Yeah.
it's just, it's an organic whole body experience. The brain is part of the body.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of thinking, a lot of our experience doesn't happen in the brain. It happens in the other parts of the body.
I love
So
that.
So that is one thing I would say about that. The other thing I would say is, people who talk about the mind-body problem and people who talk about, um, whether machines might be conscious or achieve consciousness, or whether, today's AI, which I mean is engineering marvel. I mean, it's really these are amazing systems that people are building. When people ask, well, could that machine be conscious, right? They have what's called a Turing test. If you have a conversation with it and you can't tell if you're talking to a human or a machine,
Hmm.
then maybe it's conscious. Who knows? How would we ever know the difference, right? And I think thinking about music, that's how you know the difference.
Mm.
Music is really the differentiator, I think, from in many ways, from a point of view of the scientific approach to consciousness.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't think there's a mind body problem either. And I even think the people that do have a really particular theory of consciousness and they feel definitive about it, I think
Mhm.
it's its own trap to some degree because it's such an interesting mystery that I don't think could ever be pinned down fully.
Mhm.
You can never really remove the subjectivity of it and all of the other elements to it, but
Exactly.
it's fun to explore and to hear all these people's perspectives. But sometimes I think what happens is people get pigeonholed or stuck down a path, a groove,
Right.
and it doesn't lead you to more and more questions. Sometimes it leads you to a reductionist mindset. And so it sounds to me like you're reducing things in the scientific way, but you're also, it creates more questions and you find out more and more about it. You're not trying to find
Right.
the end all answer.
I mean, that yeah, gives me a lot here. So, um, first of all, um, reductionism. So when we talk about the mind, many people take a very functionalist point of view, right? In cognitive science, it's sometimes called the computationalist point of view. The mind or the brain or the mind exists to solve problems.
Mm,
Geez, how am I going to get to work this morning? I have a flat tire or whatever. The mind exists to solve problems, and as long as you have maybe this engineered artificial intelligence system that can solve the same problems as people, it's functionally equivalent. So what's the difference?
mm,
Well, the difference exactly is what you said. It's subjectivity. It's our human experience, right?
yep.
And some people I've heard people argue that, well, maybe ChatGPT is conscious. No, it's not. I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. Um, and the way you can really see that is when you start thinking about music. Okay, when you think about music, um, it's different from language in the sense that, I can have ChatGPT help me write a letter of recommendation for a student, right? And as long as it gets the right words and, maybe I edit it a little bit, that's great. But when you're studying music, music is always about the human experience. It's always about my subjective experience. Um, it's about the phenomenology. What happens? What does it feel like? And that's what today's AI systems and
Mm-hmm.
the computational theory of mind that's pursued by cognitive scientists, that's what they're leaving out.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's hard to measure love and heartache and what is all of that, and it's such a complex thing to get curious about. And a lot of times I feel like I've heard the term neuromania, and that seems to be one of the issues in the neuroscience field is that people do think of the brain as this top-down approach and that it's the main hub of consciousness, but now we're finding out that the gut plays such a role and the heart plays such a
Exactly the
role
gut,
and the nervous system and
It's
the
as smart as the
fascia.
brain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's such a beautiful thing to find out about all these complex systems and then see that your field and physics and biology, everybody's combining and starting to cross pollinate and have conversations, which I really appreciate about people like Michael Levin. I've been really liking his work. So it just makes things more interesting when you start to think of the integrated system and not even separating the environment from the biology either. That's such a role. So,
That's right. Yeah, so we're used to, that's right. I mean, it's such a fundamental move in Western thought to separate the person from the environment,
yeah.
right? But yeah, I mean, here at University of Connecticut, where I am, I belong to a division of the psychology department called ecological psychology, founded by a psychologist named J.J. Gibson in the 60s at Cornell. And that was one of his main points. You can't separate the body from the environment. If you really want to understand what's going on, you have to consider the whole system.
Awesome.
Right. And so the body, humans are part of the environment,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
we are one with our surroundings and with each other, and not in some, kind of hokey sense, but I mean in a real scientific sense.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and if
Absolutely.
you really want to understand things, you just start from that premise, and then it leads you to take different approaches.
Yeah. And it definitely creates different outcomes as far as how we treat the environment and how we treat our bodies behaviorally too, which is amazing. I'd
Yeah.
love to go into the basic question, which seems simple, but it's probably far more complex, is what is music?
What is music? I guess I have to say I don't really know. I mean, um, I think so. Let me go to my approach. Let me sort of tell it from a storytelling point of view and to
Yeah,
see if I can get anywhere near an answer, right?
sure.
Um, so, one of the first things I did well, the very first thing I did when I got to graduate school is I tried to build a neural network that would learn music. And
Hmm.
it worked well, like the recurrent neural networks of today, in some sense. It just wasn't very good because our learning algorithms, we didn't know how to build the right learning algorithm. But a recurrent network, and the idea was, you put in a note, um, and it predicts the next note, and then it takes that into consideration. It's a prediction thing, like ChatGPT tries to predict
Hmm.
the next word. Um, and it never got very good. So I had been reading this stuff from these people who were in the ecological psychology world in the complex systems domain. And remind me to come back to complex systems, by the way, as an alternative to reductionism. And
Hmm.
I discovered these models that they were working with, which were based on oscillation. So an oscillator is just, in a sense, it's, something that ebbs and flows, right? So it's got a frequency and it's got a phase and it's got an amplitude. So you might have a big oscillation or a small oscillation or a fast one. Um, and I started thinking, and again, this is really based on, I think, subjective experience. Um, this is what's happening when you're listening to music and you hear a beat and you hear a groove. What you're doing is there's an oscillation within you that's locking to that music.
Mm.
We call it phase locking or synchronization or entrainment. People talk about brain entrainment. There was no brain entrainment back then.
Okay.
That this was just something that, was an idea, was like an experience. So I started to experiment with that mathematics. And we had some early success. We published a paper in 1994. I did with a colleague of mine who was a graduate student also at the time, John Colin. And I felt like it was a really, really powerful approach. So in trying to develop that approach, I said, well, what else does this thing need to do? And I started trying to engineer in the ability to do this or the ability to do that. But as I read more in the literature, what I realized is physical systems that oscillate, and they're all over the world, but I mean, all over the world, all over the body. I mean, you know, um, circadian rhythms or oscillations,
Mm.
right? Um, uh, Photons in a laser beam synchronize, and that's what focuses the power of light. It makes light more powerful.
Mm.
Um, uh, the power grid is all oscillation. So, and I realized if you just look at physical oscillations and study them, they have all the answers built in.
Mm.
They have all the answers built in. So let me give you an example of that. So if you think about synchronizing, you might think, I want to synchronize to this, that's synchronization, right? But nonlinear oscillations, which are what we find in the brain, they synchronize, they resonate they have nonlinear resonances. So what's a nonlinear resonance? Well, if I do this, let's do it that way. So 2 to 1 is a nonlinear resonance. And I thought, wow, that's super interesting. And then 3 to 2, I'll tap it. Can you hear that?
For some reason, I don't, but it's probably because you have the removed
Yes,
background
probably,
noise, but
yeah,
an offbeat type thing.
yeah.
Okay.
So it's three, one, and two in the other. Those are all natural modes of resonance in a nonlinear system like we have in our brain and body.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that, I realized, well, these are common rhythmic patterns in music,
Mm.
and it's somehow built in. You don't have to learn them. They're already
Yeah.
there. So what you do when you learn is you don't learn to do 2 to 1. You just select 2 to 1 out of the possibilities that already exist, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's an evolutionary pattern that evolved probably for some advantageous reason, right? Like for some reason, we've found a way to evolve this oscillation, whether it be in the body or in all these different ways. What is your theory on why that is, the selection for that particular oscillation?
So what I would say is that so I'm also not big in this evolutionary approach to music,
Okay, cool.
honestly,
Yeah, yeah.
because I think the mistake that most people are making when they adopt an evolutionary approach is they start by assuming a computational theory of mind,
Okay.
and which is that functionalist approach,
Yeah.
and then they assume that everything we can do, every capacity we have, must have evolved, must have arisen through evolutionary selection. Okay. Evolution is selecting certain functions. But again, what I'm talking about is actually physics. Okay. So once you have an oscillator, you have all these possibilities.
Mm.
It doesn't matter whether it is, a circadian rhythm or, whether it is, a much faster oscillation in the brain that's responding to music. These
Okay.
are all possibilities that are in there. So, and, oscillations are found in every species,
Yeah.
you know, they just are used to serve different purposes.
Okay. Yeah.
So
For
we,
some
for
reason.
some reason, have co-opted these for communication and speech and in music,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I guess what I'm saying, I guess you started out with what is music. I
Mm-hmm.
think music is somehow a basic expression of the physical stuff that we're made out of.
A basic expression of the physical things we're made out of.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So these oscillations, and what I discovered later is the exact same mathematics applies to pitch and tonality and consonance and dissonance.
Okay.
So that these patterns, 2 to 1, 3 to 2. So what these are, one way you can think about them is, there's a hierarchy of complexity based on these integer ratios. So 1 to 1 is the simplest.
Mm.
2 to 1 is the next most complicated. And when I say simplest, more complicated, just add the numerator and the denominator. So 2 plus 1.
Mm-hmm.
3 to 1, 3 to 2, which is a polyrhythm. Bop, 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 bop. 4 to 3, bop, 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 bop. Okay. And they get more and more complicated. Now, if I were to play these as a drummer and I would try to learn these, some of them, they get pretty hard, right? Um, so that hierarchy, that mathematical hierarchy that you discover when you study oscillation and neural oscillation, is really reflected actually in how hard those things are to learn.
Mm.
You can learn them.
Yeah.
The harder ones take longer.
Yep.
And they're never really, no matter how well you learn them, no matter how good a drummer you are, the more complex ones are always a little less stable.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems interesting too how some people are far more prone to be really good at drumming or rhythm, and then some people just will never have the capacity. And I've heard you speak to some people just will never have the ability to have a beat, right?
Right, that's right. And it's really, fascinating. We used to bring people into the lab, and one of the experiments that we did a lot is you play some music, some complex rhythm, and you just ask them to tap the beat,
Yeah.
right? And seems really simple, It's an interesting problem, right? How can there be a complex rhythm and somehow you get this, simple beat out of it? But seems like everybody should be able to do it. And we would bring in people, and a pretty large percentage, maybe 10%, just wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
And we would think to ourselves, maybe we didn't explain it well enough.
Yeah.
Maybe, so we'd go and we'd, rewrite our instructions to our subjects. And still there was 10% of people who couldn't do it. And then, later on, a few years later, a colleague of mine up in Montreal, Isabelle Peretz, discovered what she calls arrhythmia. So the inability to do that, there are just some people who can't do it.
Yeah.
you know. But I also think dynamical systems explains that really well because, this is, the dynamics and all those nonlinear linearities that you get out depend on how strongly coupled, two parts of the brain are. And weaker coupling just means it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you told me to come back to complex system in regards to
Oh,
this.
yeah. So you mentioned reductionism. So I want to try and hit on some of these things that,
Sure.
that you're bringing up. So the reductionist point of view is a very traditional move in science, right? You take things apart and try to find the basic bits and understand the basic bits. And if you can do that, then you put them all together and then you have an understanding of the whole system. But one of the things that we've learned in the past, I don't know, 40 years or so, maybe longer, even in physics, is that reductionism, it just can't tell us everything about a complex system. Sometimes it's not about the properties of the bits themselves, it's about the properties of their interactions.
Like a symphony.
Like a symphony, exactly. So, and it's that sort of approach that I take to the brain. So, some people would say, well, you need to really understand how this kind of neuron, the details of how it fires, or how this axon transmits the signal. And sometimes that's very important, especially if you get, some kind of neurological disorders, certain types. But I think most of the time, if we want to explain things like how people hear music or perform music or, any complex behavior, it's not about understanding the bits. It's about understanding their interactions. And that's why it's possible to take a neurodynamic approach like I'm taking.
Awesome. Yeah, and I've heard people call you the Gonzo approach to neuroscientists. Have you been told that, I'm sure? Like Gonzo
That
journalism?
probably came from, that must have come from the bio on my website. Actually, I had a friend who, when ChatGPT
That's what it
first
was. Yeah.
came out, he said, "Oh, I was looking for something to do, so I told it to rewrite your bio
Yeah.
in the style of Hunter S. Thompson." And it said,
Oh,
Gonzo neuroscientist or something.
that's
I
where I
thought it
read
was
that. Okay.
so great that I put it up on my website. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I remember reading
um,
that at some point, but then it mixed
I'd
in
love
with.
to be able to live up to the Gonzo moniker there.
Yeah, just need some drugs and some new glasses.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I would love to ask you a little bit about when you talked a little bit about what you said about rhythm and symphony here. What about non-native EMF and what we've done to our environments? And then even going back to the classical era, I was thinking how we changed and we did this classical tuning and we changed the way that our hertz went from like it's at 440 or whatever it is. But at some point in time, if you go back, it was more lower tones
Right.
and more organic. And supposedly, I've heard these weird theories, and I'm sure you have now at this point from people like Rockefeller-funded Nazi propaganda was oriented through some of these frequencies to maybe manipulate or try to control populations. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of that once you start to see, oh, there's
What
healing.
you said EMF? What do you mean EMF? Not electromagnetic.
Non-native EMF, just meaning like a ceiling fan or having Wi-Fi in the house and all these things that we've created in the environment that actually have an effect on our biology and on our cognition. And you start to think about how music is vibration and frequency and how it's so healing potentially. There's also a lot of non-native EMF in our environments now, and sounds and cities, and I'm sure it's having a huge effect on the way that we feel cognitively, because when you go out in nature for 5 to 7 days, by day 3, you start to actually feel like you've defragged and got rid of that fog. And you feel clear, and your sensory perception increases. Or if you get in a sensory deprivation tank, same thing, you amplify your ability to just feel like you're enhanced. So I'm curious your thoughts on this.
Oh, well, phew, that's a lot. I mean, I'm sure it is true that all this sort of noise pollution and I think more generally, maybe what you described could be called vibration pollution or
Yep.
oscillation pollution. I don't know.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that certainly, well, first of all, just certainly, having so much, being surrounded by so much actual noise, so much sound,
Hmm.
is bad for your auditory system. It causes hearing loss. That's
Hmm.
we know for sure. But that's too simple. I think another point would be to say that um, your nervous system recognizes what's important to you
Hmm.
and is really good at filtering out stuff that's not important. Okay. So, so what happens in the brain is called habituation. Your brain just habituates. So if you go into a room and there's a ceiling fan, at first you might think, God, that's a really annoying ceiling fan. You sit there for 5 minutes and you don't hear it anymore until someone turns it off. And then you
Mm.
realize it was on, right?
Yeah.
So now whether or not that kind of experience has a detrimental effect, I actually guess I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that the extent to which things like that have been studied. You might even know better than I do. Um, but but taking it back to music for a minute, what I would say is that I talked about oscillation and about how oscillation is a sort of a very natural phenomenon. You find it even in physics, and our brain uses biological oscillations, when we're listening or performing music. Um, but also there's a learning component. So if you think about, in your brain, maybe you have two oscillatory populations of neurons, they can learn, and they might have different frequencies, and they learn to connect together.
Mm.
What I think happens when you do that, and this might be through music, through like meditative chanting or so forth, um, you're really tuning your brain, right? So I think that something like music, like the musics of different cultures, for example, um, really, they're not merely an expression of that culture, but they're a way of that culture impressing itself on you,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
So it's not merely that Indian music is different from European music because Indians have a different culture,
Hmm.
but that music itself helps shape the way they think and act and feel,
Okay.
and make is one of the things that makes, you know, uh, for example, Indians different from Europeans.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and when I think of this, it immediately makes me think of people like you who are trying to find ways to use music for tuning the brain or the body in a healing way. But it also
Hmm.
immediately makes me aware of the people that might want to use it for negative reasons. Like we know the CIA uses
Oh,
music to influence culture, or,
mhm.
and that was the piece I was wondering about with
Right.
changing the classical tuning. Was it intentional or was it just a byproduct of the time? Where we increase the pitch a little bit and then it permanently shapes our culture forever. So how
Right.
much of it is intentional and social engineering and how much of it just a byproduct
Well,
of
that absolute pitch level, as far as the scientific studies that I'm aware of, that actual pitch level doesn't make so much of a difference.
hmm,
Um, for example, Helmholtz, who was a physicist originally, who was really one of the founding fathers of psychology, and he studied vision and hearing.
hmm,
Um, he thought that we should tune middle C to 256 hertz.
hmm,
Why?
hmm,
Because it's a power of two. Okay. And you divide by, and an octave is twice the frequency. So 256 would be middle C. The C below that would be 128, and so forth.
Mm.
Um, it came out to be closer to 262. Who knows why? I don't
Yeah.
really know why. I think, the idea was a little bit sharper is a little bit more exciting. So a little bit higher frequency is a little more exciting. Um, so, um, so restate your question again. So
So,
about
like,
the,
there's always people that want, like you're doing, you're in the lab trying to figure out, which I'd love to get into how you structure your studies and how you pick which hertz and which music to use and which ones you're finding are better. But if you were, say, a nefarious actor or wanted to use it for, say, neurolinguistic
oh, right.
programming, is there a frequency or a way to pitch music that would maybe be more, uh, make
Oh,
people
right.
more
So I
suggestible?
think that I wouldn't say it would be an absolute frequency, but it's the relationship between frequencies that are important. So that
Okay.
octave is 2 to 1. Remember, I told you that tonality was in a way very similar to rhythm. So the octave is 2 to 1. That's the
Mm-hmm.
simplest rhythm too, right? Remember? Um, but then a musical fifth is 3 to 2, and a
Mm.
musical fourth is 4 to 3. And actually, when I say that to you, I'm lying a little bit because it's not exactly 3 to 2 and it's not exactly 4 to 3. When Pythagoras 2,500 years ago came up with a way to tune the musical scale, he said should be perfect 3 to 2 and perfect 4 to 3, and everything else should be derived from that.
Hmm.
Um, but the problem is when you tune your scale like that, you can't change keys because then all of a sudden everything's out of tune.
Oh, okay.
So what we did is we developed in the West a system called just intonation. Actually, there's some evidence that it was actually used in China 2,000 years ago, but we can go into that if you want. Um, we discovered a way of using just the system called, I'm sorry, equal temperament. That was more of an approximation. So you get very close to 3 to 2 and 4 to 3, but some of the other frequency ratios are farther off.
Mm.
Um, but we learned this. We learned to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons that plasticity is important. It takes that resonance region, that
Mm.
natural resonance region that oscillators have, and it can expand it a little bit so you can learn to deal with these things.
Mm.
Um, I think first of all, I would say it's not the absolute frequency, it's the relationship between frequencies that are as important.
Okay.
And by the way, just another little story, directors of choral groups, especially when they're singing a cappella, will instruct them to not use, equal tempered tuning, but to use what's called just intonation,
Okay.
the actual pure integer ratios, and it really sounds better when they do that.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah. About using music for nefarious purposes or for good purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, geez, I mean, I've never been tortured by the CIA, so I don't exactly know what they do. But what I've seen on TV is, very dissonant kind of screamo music being played at very loud levels.
Mm.
And I certainly think, that could have a detrimental effect, especially, if it's interrupting your sleep. But it also, I mean, is historically um, viewed as unpleasant, these dissonant intervals.
Mm.
We call it consonance and dissonance, right? And by the way, so if you take these integer ratios, right, that are predicted by nonlinear oscillation, um, and you compare their stability. So we think in terms of stability in neurodynamics and musical neurodynamics, not in terms of consonance and dissonance per se. But if you ask a Western listener to rate pleasantness of those, it will follow exactly the integer ratio prediction, by the
Wow.
way.
Mm.
Yeah. So I really think it's stability. What your brain is looking for is stability,
Yeah.
right? Um, and not predicting the next note, by the way. I
Yeah.
mean, it's predicting the next note, but that's all in service of finding a stable interpretation of what's going on. So when you make things, maximally unstable, as you might with very dissonant, very loud, very angry rock and roll music,
Hmm.
or even with maybe music that doesn't have a tonal center, so your brain really can't latch onto what's going on next. That's when, that signals, instability to your
Right.
brain. And perhaps that's, why people find it, many people find it unpleasant.
Mm. Yeah, and I've heard you speak to the difference between live music. Somebody's doing studies and showing that that actually outperforms doing it through, say, a speaker. Like the
Hmm.
effect is stronger. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. This isn't my research. This is a research of my collaborator, Laurel Trainer, up at
Oh, cool.
McMaster University in Canada. But yeah, and others. She's not the only one, of course. But yes, people are finding that if the effect on your brain, the measurable effects, the strength of entrainment to the rhythms, for example, is stronger when you can actually see the music being performed.
Yeah.
And they have they do very beautiful studies up there. I mean, they have a auditorium that's built specifically for doing these studies. So they can have, I don't know, 100 people or more
Wow.
come in. They can measure their physiology. They've got EEG on the performers, EEG on many of
Hmm.
the listeners, and they can exactly reproduce the sound of the live performance with the recording.
Wow.
And so, it's very carefully done study. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and it just like when you go see a live show, there's so much interaction between the people that are listening and the musician themselves that they're actually doing a feedback loop and they're feeding off of the
Exactly.
audience, and there's so much more happening there.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I find this experience also just, giving a lecture to a group of undergraduates, I'm looking at them. If
Yeah.
they're interested, I can see that something I say sparks their interest.
Yeah.
That's a good lecture. If they're just sitting there and,
Yeah.
sleeping or on their phones or
Yeah.
whatever, bored, that's going to be a bad lecture.
Yeah.
I mean, because I'm
Even
not getting anything back.
Yep, even doing these Zoom type conversations, they're neat and it's amazing that you and I can talk to each other from across the world. But it's when you have someone in person too, there's a component to it that has to
Right.
do with energy exchange that
Hmm.
makes it easier and easier to connect and to empathize and all of these elements of connection. But it's still really cool that you and I can do this and then extend it to who knows how many people listening and still create an effect. So,
Yeah, no, it's great, but you're right. Better if we're in the same room.
yeah.
Because you really do have an exchange of much more energy and information.
Yeah. So I'd love to go into the neural resonant theory and the things that you feel are the biggest discoveries that you've made, and maybe even how you structure some of these studies to help people understand what it is you're doing and what you're discovering.
Well, fundamentally, so I talked, about oscillation and, from really a mathematical point of view. So when we first articulated this theory, the original sort of version of it, well, I guess we called it resonance then. But what people really picked up on was something called dynamic attending. So what we had this idea that um, maybe these oscillations in the brain, these neural oscillations, are put to work to help you pay attention in your environment. So not to pay attention to, where am I going to look, but when is something going to happen? Um, and at that time in 1999, it was just a theory, and we had some math to back it up. And, there were a few psychological studies, but not that many. And so I put it out there and I just sort of held my breath. And I was like, is this true or not? I didn't know. It was just an idea.
Mm.
And slowly, after, 5, 6, 7 years, one lab does a study and then another lab does a study. We were doing our own studies, of course. And after about 10 years, the whole field started, saying, yes, this is actually true.
Mm.
Um, the rhythms in our environment capture our attention. And by the way, they do that by synchronizing real oscillations in the brain. So we now know that this is true,
Mm.
actually. And what we're doing with neuroresonance theory is we're saying, um, and by the way, for music, you actually almost don't need any further, theoretical mechanism. You have oscillation, you have neuroplasticity, which learns to link oscillatory neural populations together. Um, these imply that some musical patterns we hear are going to be more stable than others.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, However, because you have learning, which we call attunement, um, if you hear a pattern that's less stable, you hear it more often, your brain can learn to stabilize that pattern.
Mm.
Okay. So you're really seeking stability there. When you're kicked out of a stable pattern, your brain, that's like a violation of your expectancy, you might say. You're kicked out of that stable pattern. Your brain either finds a new pattern that interprets it, that finds a way to make that stable, or it's attracted. Your brain state is attracted back to that original stable pattern. So you want to hear that next note.
Okay.
Um, you know, and then there's this other part of musical neurodynamics, which we call strong anticipation. So those first three, neural resonance, stability and attraction, attunement or neuroplasticity. Strong anticipation is a really interesting one. So there's a long-standing finding. If I just play a metronome for you
Mm-hmm.
and I ask you to tap your finger in synchrony over a wide range of tempos, what happens is you will tap your finger before you hear the stimulus.
Hmm.
Okay, so why would that happen? It's not a reaction time. If it was a reaction time, your finger tap would come several hundred milliseconds after that sound.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get a few of them in a row, it establishes a rhythm. You're anticipating now.
Yeah.
You know when that next thing is going to happen. But why? What's the reason that you tap ahead of time? Okay, so the tapping ahead of time is evidence that you're anticipating. But why does it not, exactly on the beat? Why is it ahead?
Hmm.
And there have been a number of theories, and they've all been sort of debunked,
Mm.
um, for lack of a better term. Uh, it turns out that in a dynamical system, if it has feedback to itself, it will anticipate that driving signal. So that's what we call strong anticipation. And in the nervous system, we know there's always delays. Nothing is instantaneous.
Right.
Your brain is very fast, but it's not instantaneous. So all those delays cause you to anticipate.
Okay.
It's a super interesting
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Almost to keep up in a way, too.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's actually, those delays are acting as a kind of a memory.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So how do you find ways, and what have you found in ways to heal people, like Alzheimer's, different dementia? Because I used to read studies even a few years ago that this was happening, that people that were going through Alzheimer's issues would put on a headset and listen to a song that they loved, and all of a sudden they could remember more. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So you're talking about music therapy and
Mm-hmm.
music-based interventions, um, which is something that for most of my career I stayed away from. I thought of myself as a very hard-nosed scientist, very sort of rigorous, very mathematical, very experimental, um, and just wasn't sure if any of that was true. I heard stories, but I hadn't experienced any of it. Um, And, in it's about 20 years ago now, I met a woman named Connie Tomeno, who runs the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function in New York. And she said, well, we'd love to have you on our board of scientific advisors. And I said, I don't know. Inside I'm thinking, is this quackery? What's going on here? And she said, well, why don't you come up and visit us and actually see what we do? And that was my first experience of music therapy. And back at the time, she was at Beth Abraham Hospital in New York. And she was working with a group of patients who had had some sort of trauma to their brain. Some of them were older people that had strokes. Some of them were younger people who had been a victim of gang-related violence and might have had a head trauma as a result.
Hmm.
But a wide variety of different people, all having some, like inability to speak or difficulty walking because of brain trauma. So she brought me in. I mean, I saw a lot of work that was done there, but the real thing that changed my mind is I participated in a drum circle. And what happened is all these people came into this room
Mm-hmm.
and there was an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression.
Mm.
It was really, a tangible emotional experience. And we sat down. I participated in the drum circle, and it was about 20 minutes, 30 minutes long. When it was over, you could feel the difference in the room.
Mm-hmm.
That depression had lifted.
Wow.
And I thought to myself in that moment, even if that's all that music therapy does, that's valuable,
Sure.
because, your emotional state really affects how you heal. But so I began to open up to it. And over the years, we started to do some, limited studies that had some relationship to music and healing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really in about 2019. A colleague of mine named Psyche Louie, who runs something called the Mind Lab at Northeastern University. She came to me and she said, I think I know a way that we could develop an effective music-based therapy for Alzheimer's disease.
Hmm.
And I said, okay, that's just crazy. How could music, help people with Alzheimer's disease? And long story short, and if you want more details, we can do that. But
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that we could help the brain regain the ability to synchronize at a particular frequency that's relevant to memory. And that is around 40 hertz. It's called the gamma. It's really a frequency band. It's called the gamma frequency band.
Cool.
But people think in terms of 40 hertz,
Mm-hmm.
which if you wanted to think in terms of music, it's a very low bass frequency.
Okay.
Okay, that bottom octave on the piano. Um, and so there had been some studies that came out of MIT, Lee Wei Tsai's lab at MIT, that showed if you stimulate in the hippocampus, which is the brain's memory area, Alzheimer's mice at 40 hertz, it can actually reduce the amyloid beta plaque load in their brain.
Wow.
Amyloid beta are these sticky plaques that develop in the brain of Alzheimer's
Like immediately or over what period of time?
over weeks, over
Okay.
a period of weeks.
Wow.
So like this amazing effect, and it improved their memory. But I said, Psyche, how are we going to do this with music? And she said, well, there's a study you did one time. So in the early 2000s, we started doing these studies with rhythm. We were
Mm-hmm.
interested in, in testing neural resonance theory. And what we found was not only if you have a rhythmic frequency, not only do brain frequencies at that same frequency entrain, but you get bursts of higher frequencies. So bursts of gamma we found.
Mm.
And those bursts of gamma actually anticipate the sound.
Hmm.
So what we ended up doing is we developed an intervention where people listen to whatever music they like, their favorite music. We call it self-selected music. And we augment it by synchronizing a light that's simulating what should be happening in a healthy brain.
Okay.
So bursts of gamma that are happening in time with the music. And what we're finding is it actually reorganizes their brain rhythms.
Hmm.
It increases what's called theta gamma phase amplitude coupling,
Okay.
which is those lower frequencies coupled to the higher frequencies, which is also important in memory, by the way.
Hmm.
It increases activation in their hippocampus, and it's actually improving their memory,
Wow.
according to some preliminary results that we haven't quite published yet because we're still in the middle of a 5-year study. But
And what kind of light frequency is it, or what type of light is it that you're flashing?
So it's there are two frequencies. One is synchronized to the music, so it's
Right.
like got that frequency.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is within that a higher frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like,
But I mean, what source of
but in
light? Is
vision.
it red light? Is it infrared light? What kind of light is it?
Oh, we allow the patients so far to choose their own colors.
Okay, but it's
Um,
like an LED bulb or something.
but it's like an LED. Yeah,
Okay.
they're literally using an LED. Do I have one here? I do
Yeah.
have one here, but I have to dig it out of
I'm
the
just
closet.
curious about that part. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's all these neuroscientists like Glenn Jeffrey studying light and its effects on biology and how powerful, say, an incandescent bulb is
Mhm.
versus like when they use blue light on mice, it creates immediate diabetic, lethargy, all these negative
Yeah.
elements. So
So
I'm
we've
like, wow.
considered using red light.
Yeah,
But that has certain emotional connotations as well, right?
sure.
So one of the things that music does is it, affects you emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
and people like Oliver Sacks
Yeah,
suggest that, it's that emotional connection with music that is responsible for so many of the effects. So we want to
yeah,
keep, but red light is something that we are considering.
yeah.
Um,
And I wonder too for environment factors, since it's not separate, too, to do some of these studies in a non-native lighting environment, say just natural lighting out in the light from the sun, with the same
mhm.
musical things that you're doing versus in the environment that you're in, probably in a lab or whatever the environment is. You have all these LEDs, and how much of
Mhm.
light plays so much of a role on
Yeah.
physiology and on cognition that it's like, wow, we are all doing almost every study's in a bad lit environment, and I'm
Mhm.
starting to get more tuned into that being such a role in how our research is even being done.
Yeah.
But
But what we're doing actually, here, I can pull these out here. So we started out with just an array of LEDs, but the product that we're developing, and we're about ready to start, providing this to patients. So even though our study's not quite done, we're going to start selling these pretty soon.
mm,
They use a pair of glasses that look like this. These are
mm-hmm.
augmented reality, so you can see through.
Hmm.
You can actually go for a walk while you do your therapy if you want to.
Okay.
And you just put the glasses on, and there's some speakers here, and it streams your self-selected music. And then in the periphery of your vision, it's flashing lights at the two frequencies that are important, the theta frequency and the gamma frequency.
Yeah.
And they're coordinated in a certain way.
Yeah.
Um, and you could do this outside if you wanted to, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And it's running through Bluetooth, though, I'm guessing.
It's actually there. It's wired
Oh, okay.
to a little controller that you would have in your
Ah,
pocket.
interesting. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we hope to be start providing these to our first group of patients um, in June of this year. So
Fascinating. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see some of that
yeah.
work being done. So, what other ways does music heal people so far that you've discovered?
Well, so I mean, let's go back to just music itself. So talked about seeing maybe some videos in which um, music is played for people with severe Alzheimer's disease. So
Mm-hmm.
just the music itself, it can sort of wake them up, right? Patients that are not communicative, they normally just sit all day quietly, maybe can't recognize their family and so forth. If you just play music that's meaningful to them, it can bring them out of that and improve their cognition, at least on a short-term basis.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been surprised about as I've been, developing this Alzheimer's therapy is when I talk to people about it, almost all of them have some sort of personal story of someone with Alzheimer's who's a family member or a friend where they've actually experienced this happen.
Mm,
I played music for my grandmother and this happened,
cool.
you know. So it's actually, I think it's more common than I realized at first. But music is being used, to treat, anxiety and agitation in Alzheimer's patients. So you may know that Alzheimer's patients can become agitated and quite difficult to deal with. Um, And, music can calm them down. And, clinical studies have shown that music can uh, reduce the need for medication to treat anxiety. So
Mm.
many times, if you go into, a memory care center or even assisted living, the Alzheimer's patients are over medicated,
Mm-hmm.
to control this anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
Um, and if you don't need to give them all that medication and you just play them some music, that's amazing. It helps quality of sleep. It helps them to eat more. There's a lot that music sort of does by itself already.
Mm.
Um, Another really successful use of music, and this is now also becoming commercial, is music to treat Parkinson's disease. Um, so there's a company called MedRhythms that has just received FDA approval to treat as a treatment for Parkinson's disease. And the idea there is you entrain synchronized walking rhythms to music.
Mm.
So in Parkinson's disease, one problem is you have this gait freezing, this difficulty and these sort of shuffling gaits.
Okay.
And if you just turn on music and you ask people to synchronize their walking with the music, that can alleviate
Wow.
some of these problems. It's
Fascinating.
really striking. You can see videos on the web that show this happening to people.
Mm.
Um, Another is aphasia, or problems associated with stroke,
Okay.
like the patients I met through Connie Tomeno initially at Institute for Music and Neurologic Function. Um, Synchronizing med rhythms is also treating stroke patients with this
Mm.
same sort of therapy. But for specifically for aphasia, there's an approach called melodic intonation therapy. So patients, rather than doing traditional speech therapy, you're taught to sort of sing the words.
Ah.
And it's really interesting. And this goes to sort of, I think, a non-reductionist point of view, is that why is it that you have a stroke and you can't speak, but you can sing?
Huh. I didn't know
Not
that was even a
everybody,
thing.
but it's very common. That's
Wow.
why you can do melodic intonation therapy, because although you can't speak, you're able to sing.
Wow. I'd never have heard of
And
that.
yeah, so you would think, right, from a sort of functionalist, computationalist, reductionist point of view of the mind, singing is speaking plus a melody, right?
Sure.
So if you can't speak, of course you wouldn't be able to sing. Not so. To your brain, those are different things.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
It's
And then
amazing.
what is binaural beats? And then what about autism? You ever used any of these studies on autistic people?
No, let's do autism first. So no, we haven't started yet. I do have a student who is interested in studying autism, and we know that that autistic individuals do seem to have deficits in rhythm.
Okay.
So all these studies, the ability to synchronize, tapping a beat to music and so forth, all of those abilities are somewhat degraded in autism. And,
Wow.
there's a theory anyway that, you know, um, uh, you know, abilities, deficits in social coordination among autistic individuals may have something to do with rhythm. It might really be a rhythmic thing. Rhythm may be doing more than, we're even aware, just the way you're like nodding your head, and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. Um, Rhythm might be super important in communication in ways that, we haven't even fully appreciated yet.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
then what about like somatic stuff combined with rhythm, say dance or movement, like EMDR is all based on this oscillation of the hands. So you start to get
Mhm.
the somatic body involved. And a lot of that's nervous system based with the music and the lighting, things like that. Have you done anything like that yet, or is it in the works?
We haven't done any studies of dance yet, but I do have one student who's moving in that direction. And there are a number of groups I know that are doing dance therapy for Parkinson's disease, actually.
Ah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you brought up the step synchronization
Yeah,
earlier. And
yeah.
then I think of like the Flow Genome Project and people that are studying flow states from different variant ways, where you're using the body, the breath, things like that. And you look at the Heart Math Institute and people studying heart rate variability using breath and sound and om. Yogis
Hmm.
do it.
Yeah,
That vibration and singing and all of that combined. So I'm wondering, like you're saying, there's this symphony effect, and you seem to think in this way of
right.
non-reductionist. It would be so cool to start combining a lot of the flow state science with what you're
Yeah,
doing with music, because flow is so complex in itself, and we all feel better when we're getting into flow. And I've heard people healing themselves from, say, Lyme disease and other ailments by doing surfing or by doing downhill mountain bike or things that are very challenging, and you have just that enough discipline, a little surrender spot, that sweet spot.
hmm, yeah.
So anyway, some of that stuff, especially breath work, I've been practicing breath work for years,
Mhm.
and you start to increase heart rate variability by doing breath
Yeah.
holds and by doing humming. And so
Mhm.
there's a lot to combine there.
Yeah, I mean, so, that goes back, to yoga and to, very ancient practices, involved with controlling the breath. Um, I'm super interested in that. Of course, for one thing, it's something that happens to musicians as well, that flow state, because that's also a very challenging thing you have to do in real time,
Yeah.
just like, skiing or, mountain biking or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But we have actually started to look into chanting.
Cool.
So we did some pilot work this past summer in on the island of Mauritius, which is off the coast of Madagascar, in fact,
Cool.
and has a very big Hindu population who are very sort of observant and practice, traditional Vedic chanting for one thing.
Cool.
So we've taken portable EEG systems and tried to study. You mentioned, a lot of these studies are taking place in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
We've noticed that too. So, we went into the temples
Wow.
and we put, EEG caps on the practitioners there. Um, and, we're just really at the very beginning stages, but we're seeing, some really interesting and strong effects with chanting.
Cool.
Um, yeah. So, and I think, that's maybe one of the oldest forms of music, right?
Yeah.
Is chanting. And, people must have discovered this for a reason and must have maybe not discovered it for a reason. Maybe discovery was an accident, right? But have kept it going for a reason,
Yeah.
right?
And then
Or-
cultivated it. And then you talk about environment. They built these incredible temples or spaces where they would do these chants, and how
right.
much of a role that plays for an opera singer to sing in a big giant space like that.
Oh,
So
yeah. Yeah.
that's
So
cool.
yes, that space, that environment is important. And another thing that's important with in chanting, for example, is that you're with all these other people
Yeah.
and you're hearing all the other sounds and you're in the same space,
Yeah.
you know. And
Yeah.
to me, my experience, I've tried meditation, I've tried chanting and breath work and so forth. I find chanting much more powerful than individual meditation.
Yeah.
You can
Absolutely.
repeat your mantra, but when everyone is doing it at the
Oh,
same
yeah.
time, room full
Yep.
of people, forget
Oh,
about it.
yeah. You feel like
Yeah,
you're in a light socket of vibration. There's so much
exactly.
energy happening. I like
Exactly.
doing it too. I did it once with this man named Rupert Sheldrake. His wife teaches sound healing, but through voice and chant. And she had
Hmm.
every person, we were in this huge, beautiful geodesic dome, and she had each type of person based off of maybe astronomy or astrology, I'm sorry,
Hmm.
have a different pitch. And anyway, it was probably a few hundred people, and we found our own pitch, but it all sort of correlated and resonated together. And I've never vibrated more in my life. Like the buzzing, there was just so much energy in the room, and everybody was
Yeah,
buzzing, and it was truly immaculate. It was amazing. So I believe in
yeah,
the power of sound for healing, for sure.
yeah, definitely, definitely.
Cool. Is there anything else for the person I'm looking over here at my notes? I have tons. Like there's primate studies. Um,
We didn't even get into the primates. That's too bad.
yeah, maybe we could go there.
Okay. Well, so you mentioned evolution, and I told you, I'm not big on that sort of approach to understanding music, but a number of people are, and I have worked with some of them. And because I mean, the questions are asking about animals are interesting, whether or not it has any bearing on human music. And so a number of people have asked, beginning, I guess, with my colleague Ani Patel up at Tufts University, who studied uh, I want to say cockatoo. Is that right? Anyway, I don't know, cockatoo, maybe. Um, and so it was Snowball,
Mm.
okay? And Snowball listened to the Backstreet Boys and sort of spontaneously started dancing. And this is on YouTube, and he went and he visited the owners and, actually did a scientific study and found that, yeah, he seems to be influenced by that musical rhythm, or she, I guess. So a number of people have said, okay, well, let's try other animals, because prior to that, people would write in scientific articles, their introduction would be, rhythm is interesting because only people can do it, only
Mm.
people can hear the beat of music. Well, no, it seems like Snowball can.
Mm.
And then so people started looking at chimpanzees, bonobos. We did bonobos, I did, um, and uh, sea lions.
Mm.
So it turns out that there's a sea lion called Ronan out in Santa Cruz, who's actually much better than Snowball in terms of synchronization. So Snowball is dancing, and the dancing is cool. And, Snowball probably didn't have to be trained. We're not 100% sure, but um, the sea lion required a little bit of training, a few minutes. But once that was done, uh, Ronan synchronized to everything, synchronized to the Backstreet Boys, synchronized to,
Mm.
disco, synchronized to all different kinds of music, all different tempos, and never missed, literally never misses a beat.
Wow. That's impressive.
So Ronan is as good as a person in synchronizing.
That's cool.
So um, I think it goes to the idea that there is something really fundamental about neural oscillation that as long as you can connect it to that sound, as long as your brain can connect it to the sound, you
Mm-hmm.
can synchronize or you could learn
Wow.
to synchronize, right?
Yeah.
Now, not every animal does this spontaneously, but some do.
Mm-hmm.
But even the ones that don't do it spontaneously, once you show them what you want, they can do it. Just
Yeah.
that, yeah. So it's a lot of interesting stuff going on there now. We've done bonobos. There's a colleague in Mexico in UNAM, Hugo Merchant, and he's been studying macaque monkeys.
Mm.
And one reason the macaques are interesting is that you can do invasive studies. So you can actually put electrodes in your brain. You could never do that with a chimpanzee or a
Mm.
bonobo, but people feel okay about doing it with macaques. Um, and it took quite some time, but he has now been able to show that macaques can learn to synchronize. They have to be taught. They really have to
Mm.
be taught to synchronize with sound. But once you teach them, they can do it. And he's actually able to show the oscillation in their brain.
Wow.
And there have been mathematical studies now. Um, John Rinzel and his student at NYU, Claudia Zemlianova, mathematicians have looked at that brain data
Wow.
and have showed how that really complex brain circuit in the macaques um, can be reduced to a simple dynamical system. And when you do that, what do you get? You get an oscillation.
That's fascinating.
So, so there's a lot of really cool, exciting stuff going on in that field right now. Um, yeah, yeah.
That's so
It's,
cool. Yeah, it makes me wonder too how important it will be like for babies in the womb and how playing, say, Bach or something,
mhm.
just some basic music for them in the womb, how much a baby in the developmental stage would be synced up to the music in the environment, and how important that might be for health.
Yeah, so there was an interesting study recently. Um, Laurel Trainer and her colleague in Paris, whose name is escaping me right now, um, they did some study on preterm infants.
Wow.
And because there was some controversy about, some of the findings, they did a study on preterm infants with something called NEARS, which is a way of measuring what's going on in the cortex. Um, and they showed that preterm infants who should be in the womb, but they're not because of, an accident. Um, Preterm infants, you play them music, you get activation in their motor cortex,
Wow.
which is, by the way, where I should have said this first thing, where we think, the beat is actually people register the beat. So
Hmm.
there's activity in their motor cortex when they hear a musical beat.
Wow.
Um,
Interesting.
so yeah, it's probably going on very, very early in prenatal development.
Yeah. How cool. I never did hear your thoughts on what are binaural beats and what is that company and what do you think of it?
Well, there are a lot of people doing binaural beats, I'll have to say. I know several.
Okay.
So, so binaural beats are interesting. So if you play two tones, just forget about binaural for a minute. You
Hmm.
play two tones together that have a frequency separation. They'll interfere with one another, and you'll get beats at the difference, called the difference frequency.
Okay.
Um, and it's just the way the math works out. You take these two frequencies, you calculate the difference, and that's the frequency of the interference. So it turns out that if you put one of those frequencies in this ear and one of these frequencies in this ear, so they're not interacting in the air,
Hmm.
you could still hear that third tone, that difference tone.
Okay.
And that's what's called binaural beats.
Okay.
So what that shows scientifically is that um, these two frequencies are interacting not in the air but in your brain.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I think people have claimed a lot about health benefits or some other kinds of benefits of binaural beats. Some of it proves out scientifically, some of it doesn't. Um, I know at least three different companies who are trying to use binaural beats to sort of uh, embed them in music for various health reasons. So one might be to treat Alzheimer's. So you could try to do a binaural beat at 40 hertz to stimulate the same thing that we're doing in my company.
Okay.
Um, Sort of, I think maybe one problem with that is just once you make it so soft that it's not ruining the music, um, that maybe it's not having that same entrainment effect on the brain. So I think that's a real concern.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I mean, it's definitely a real effect. I
Yeah.
think there's probably a lot of overclaiming in terms of what health benefits they might have.
Hmm.
But it would also depend on what frequency you're trying to stimulate in the brain and why, right?
Yeah. It made me also curious. This might be a silly question, but deaf people and their ability to use music, is there a way to affect deaf people with music, vibration, sound, that they could maybe hear or experience music? I mean, what are your theories on that?
Well, so people who can't hear or have trouble hearing often have cochlear implants. The cochlear implants are not really very good yet at resolving pitch.
Okay.
So they give you enough pitch resolution that you can recognize speech,
Okay.
but you can't hear like semitones, which would be important for enjoying music, but you can hear the rhythm.
Hmm.
And people who are deaf are as good at hearing rhythm as you or I.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
Interesting.
Pitch is going to take some time. It's probably going to take some technological, invention to
Okay.
before they're able to hear pitch again. But certainly with rhythm can affect them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So, for example, you know, uh, if you had a cochlear implant and you wanted to use our music-based intervention for Alzheimer's, it would probably be effective because you can hear the rhythm, and then the rest of the stimulus is the light.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the current movement of psychedelic therapy for mental health and implementing music with that? And what are your thoughts on the whole psychedelic movement in combination with some of this stuff you're working on?
Well, for psychedelics, I mean, I have read some of the research. I went to a conference and I spoke to a psychiatrist who's at length, actually, who's using this in her practice. I think, the evidence is very compelling. Um, Psychedelic, especially, I'm most familiar with, ketamine and psilocybin,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that research. And I think that, it's clearly having a physiological effect on the brain. It's changing, what's happening in your synapses, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the longest longitudinal study that I'm aware of, I think was in mice now that I think about, um, that effect doesn't go away. I think the longest study is like 6 months or something.
Mm-hmm.
After 6 months, one dose, 6 months later, it's still
Yeah.
change
Pretty
is still
profound.
there. Um, and some of the psychological research that I'm aware of, suggests that people with severe depression, suicidal, after a 6 week, or sorry, 6 sessions with ketamine therapy, are essentially cured, a large percentage of them. So I think it's real science. I think it's really exciting. And in fact, that psychiatrist, when I spoke with her, I said, well, why don't we do a study? We'll try music too.
Yeah.
And she she thought it was just too much,
Oh, really?
And I think
Hmm.
it is very, I don't know if you've tried ketamine therapy or psilocybin, but I think it's very, very intense and might be very difficult to study the two together.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, as far as
so,
studying it goes, I could see that. But man, music plays such a role. I've had plenty of experiences over the years on psilocybin.
mhm,
And yeah, it's
mhm.
beautiful to not have music, of course. But then when you do have music, it's probably
Yeah,
one of
the
the most
music
amazing.
certainly enhances that experience. Yes.
Yeah, so I could see that being a beautiful combination in the future if you do nail it down to what is the most beneficial type of music or whatever you
Mhm.
guys do discover with that. But
Yeah.
float tanks as well. There's a lot of neuroscience being studied on flotation therapy
Yeah.
and, having a certain type of music for maybe part of your float to
Hmm.
introduce or end the float with that type of stuff you're doing would be cool to have combination with.
Yeah.
But yeah, anything else you want to share about the work you're doing, stuff that's cutting edge, or do we cover most of that?
I think you've covered most of it. I mean, I think, if I could just leave you with anything, I suppose it would be that, you know, um, you know, our brains aren't just computers. We're not just predicting the next things happening out in the world, but, um, we are sort of, and our minds are not separate from our body. It's all one thing.
Mm,
Um, we work together. We're part of our environment,
yeah.
and that's it. So that when we listen to music, we internalize the music. We don't just like compute it. We become part of it. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And that's why music can be used for health, right? If we were
beautiful.
just computers,
So
wouldn't
it's
be
like
the same.
life is music, really. It's sort of a
Life is
rhythm.
music. Yeah, and the brain is kind of a symphony,
That's amazing.
of
Yeah,
different oscillations, and that's sort of what music is tapping into.
that's
Then
awesome.
that's what I meant way back at the beginning by saying music is kind of an expression of what we are.
Mm,
It is an expression of this rhythmic nature of our being, right?
yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. Well, I ask all my guests if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world if you could say anything?
I think I just said it. I don't know. Yet machines are not conscious. Um, we are conscious. We have phenomenological experiences, and that's what we should be trying to understand when we study consciousness and we study the brain and we study
Mm,
physiology.
I love it.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been fun chatting with you and learning from you right now and sharing what you're doing with the world. So thank you.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe to the show and rate the show. That helps people to discover it. And enjoy the next episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort.